Hi, and welcome back to another one of our online lectures here in World History. Today we're going to finish our unit on French Absolutism, Enlightenment, and the French Revolution by talking about Napoleon. Just about everybody's heard of Napoleon, but not everybody knows his full story. So we really want to look at who he was, what he meant to France, and ultimately we're going to kind of see some of the good things that he did and some of the bad things he did for the French people, because he really is a mixed bag of accomplishments. So we've got one constructive response question we will be able to answer by the end of this. And the question simply says, trace the development and reign of Napoleon Bonaparte. We'll definitely be able to talk a little bit about how he came to power, some of the things he did for France while he was the leader of France, and ultimately we're going to look at the three big costly mistakes that he makes that costs him his empire. And that's all built into our roadmap here. So we're going to talk about his early military success. We're going to talk about how Napoleon rules France. We'll look at his three big mistakes: the continental system, the Peninsular War, and the invasion of Russia, which ultimately gets him banished in the end twice. And that story is kind of a fun one, but you know, it's really just entirely Napoleon. It just is. It's one of those historical stories that when you hear a leader getting banished, we automatically think of Napoleon. So that's how we'll wrap up his story here today. So we're going to start with Napoleon, kind of looking at who was he, kind of get to know him a little bit. After all, this isn't just part of his story. It's really going to be his whole story. The one thing I won't focus heavily on in today's lesson on Napoleon is his military successes, because we could talk a lot about that. I mean, he really is one of the best military-minded leaders we've ever seen. He's one of the most successful military commanders of all time. And I'm going to tell you that without really giving you a lot of details behind that, because it's less significant to this story. So when we do talk about who was Napoleon, we certainly have to talk about just this great military-minded guy who ultimately comes to rule France. So let's start with this part of the story. Napoleon Bonaparte, who was he? He was born in 1769 on a Mediterranean island of Corsica. If you look at this little map here, you can see France. And if you look just down and to the east, you see this little red filled in area. That is Corsica. So he wasn't necessarily born in France, but he was born very nearby there. Now, the rumor always has been is that he was a little guy, short guy. Truth be told, he actually wasn't 5'3". We think he was closer to 5'7", which was fairly average for a Frenchman at this time. So this has kind of become one of the myths of Napoleon, that because he was such a short guy that he had this short complex and wanted to do all these great things to overcome his height. And we really don't think that's really the truth of Napoleon. And like I mentioned, he is considered one of the greatest military leaders of all time. I'm not necessarily going to prove that to you today, because like I said, that's less significant to this story. I want to see what he does for France and ultimately what costs him his empire. So you're going to have to just sort of take my word for it that he's one of the greatest military leaders of all time. I have this article. You can certainly stop and read it if you want to. I'm not going to read all of this to you, but basically I found this saying how with the records the way they were, I mean, things don't translate perfectly into inches in the way we measure things today. So we thought he was 5'2", maybe 5'3", according to French units, but really that translates more to like 5'6" or 5'7", as you can see here. So it's just a little bit of a story on how we got to know his true height as a human being. So to look at Napoleon, we have to kind of figure out how he becomes influential, how he becomes the leader that he eventually becomes. So we're going to do that through looking at his successes in something called a coup d'etat, which is definitely a French word you'll get to know by the end of this slide. So in October 1795, we have the tail end of the French Revolution going on. Louis has had his head chopped off. Marie has had her head chopped off. Robespierre has had his head chopped off. And that doesn't mean the revolution's over. So it's still kind of going on. And so we had rebels who really wanted to put down the French Revolution, who marched on the National Convention, where Napoleon, who was a fairly young man fighting for the French military at the time, where he and his gunners were able to successfully force these rebels to panic and flee. Basically, he was hailed as a hero in France because he was able to keep the revolution alive. These were people who were moving in to try to stop the revolution, and Napoleon and his troops upheld it. So they were seen as, really positive to keeping the ideas of the revolution going. In 1796, Napoleon was appointed to lead the French army against Austria and the Kingdom of Sardinia, and with that he swept down into Italy and won a series of victories. So basically what I'm trying to say here is that he had a lot of success early on. Napoleon read his history, he knew his military tactics, and when he went into battle, he usually won quite easily and quickly. So he defeats Austria, defeats Sardinia, wins in Italy. I mean, basically everywhere he goes, he wins. But there is an exception. His exception is always going to be the British. He's basically going to try to defeat the British many different times, and he fails most of those times. So he tried to repeat his success in Egypt, but he was defeated by Horatio Nelson. Well, Horatio Nelson is an admiral in the British Navy. The British Navy, as you're going to find out, really becomes #1 in the world during this time. So Napoleon's going to have a tough time defeating them. Now, you'd think, if Napoleon loses a big battle, that's going to get back home. People are going to know about that. It's going to be printed in the newspapers. But Napoleon was smart. Napoleon kept this out of the newspapers. He was able to basically beat everybody back home to France and sort of censor this information from getting out to the people. So most of the people in France never even knew that he had lost to the British. And so he was still a hero to the French people. By 1799, the Directory, which was the new government in France, post-revolution government, had lost the political confidence of the people. That's the thing about revolutions, is you always have to put something new in place, and sometimes those new governments or those new ruling bodies don't always work so well. I mean, change, when you have revolution, just because you put something new in there, you have a change, doesn't mean it's going to succeed. And that's what's going on here. So this new government, the Directory, had lost political confidence of the people. And after his return from Egypt, people look at Napoleon and go, you should rule. I mean, we've got this revolution thing that's still going on. We need some type of leader. Napoleon, why don't you be that guy? So Napoleon's urged to seize political power. Well, Napoleon becomes first consul in France and assumes power as a dictator. Now, he's not a monarch, he's not a king, he's not a queen, but through sort of this lack of power in France, he and his popularity, he really becomes kind of the ruler of France. Well, that leads to something called a coup d'etat. It's a French word that means sudden seizure of power or blow to the state. So through this coup d'etat, he really takes power. And the people of France, because they like military victories, are okay with this. They see this as a positive change, which is ridiculous when you think about it, because in the French Revolution, they fought against an absolute monarch. And here they are giving power to one person again, which is something they really probably shouldn't have done when you continue to see Napoleon's story. I'm just going to show you a little bit of this slide because it mimics what I just talked about. Here's the campaign in Egypt where he loses to Horatio Nelson. This map doesn't really show you a lot, but it just kind of shows you here's Nelson's group, and they're able to defeat Napoleon at sea. Here's Horatio Nelson himself. And it says, abandoning his troops in Egypt, Napoleon returned to France and received a hero's welcome. Nobody even knew that he had lost that battle. So I think that kind of goes to the ego of Napoleon, but also the smarts that he had. Because leaders will lose battles. It does happen, and you can't let that demoralize you or your people, and that's certainly not what happened here. So Napoleon becomes the ruler of France. So let's see what Napoleon does as he rules France. In 1800, there was a plebiscite. A plebiscite is simply a vote of the people, kind of like democracy. And that plebiscite approved a new constitution which gave all of the real power in France to Napoleon as first consul. Consul is a word that the Romans used, so we kind of see a little bit of a parallel there. And he kept many of the changes of the revolution. This is smart. He knows the people have just fought this bloody revolution. He can't come in and undo those things. He has to look sympathetic to the revolution. If not, the people are going to tear him limb from limb or chop his head off, just like they did with Louis and Marie. So he's definitely going to keep many changes from the revolution. One of the things he does, he looks at the economy. He knows France was deeply in debt, so he righted the economy by creating a new national banking system and efficient tax collection. This is smart because you need revenue. You need money to pay for your troops and to pay for your infrastructure, and you got to make that somewhat fair and reasonable to the people. It can't just be the poor people who are paying. So he fixes that. Next, he signs a concordat, which is essentially an agreement with the Pope, basically giving the church back to France. So the government recognized the influence of the church, but rejected church control in national affairs. What that means is that the Catholic Church is now back in France, but Napoleon has got control over political matters, over military matters, things like that. The church can't control those, which of course gives Napoleon a lot of power when you really think about it that way. So when we looked at the French Revolution and how the French Revolution temporarily removed the Catholic Church, it is now back in France. He created the Napoleonic Code. The Napoleonic Code was a uniform set of laws that eliminated many injustices. Again, it supports the revolution, but it helps fix some of the laws that are needed here in France to have a stable government and stable ruling power. Kind of give you a little bit of an idea of that. This slide sort of looks at the Napoleonic Code. It was divided into three parts. You had civil law based on personal status, property, and the acquisition of property. And this purpose was to reform the French legal code to reflect the principles of the French Revolution. The idea was France is still, in relative chaos, and things need to be stabilized, laws need to be written and organized, and that's exactly what the Napoleonic Code did. So you can see he's doing some pretty good things for France. This is just an image Napoleon had painted for himself, definitely showing Napoleon and his code. Napoleon is known to have this pretty big ego, thought very highly of himself. And there's a lot of paintings that he had commissioned that show that. And so one would look at this and see that he's basically ordained by God, or there's some type of divine power here hovering over him that is giving him his power or his strength. And that's certainly what you see here. This is my favorite part of Napoleon's story, because if you really want to talk about ego, you have to look at what he becomes. He's not just the first consul of France. He becomes the emperor of France. That's a very strong word. Again, definitely mimicking what the Romans used. And he remembers his history. He knew about Charlemagne being crowned emperor by the Pope. So as the story goes, Napoleon puts together this whole coronation ceremony. He invites the Pope, has everybody there, down to the finest details. This is going to be a big show. He walks up to the front of the church where the Pope is going to crown him emperor, and he grabs the crown out of the hands of the Pope, places it on his own head, effectively crowning himself emperor. So he crowned himself emperor in 1804 when he took the crown from the Pope and placed it on his own head. In a way, that's smart, because if you remember Charlemagne's story, it showed when the Pope crowned Charlemagne, it showed that the Pope had more power. Now here's years later, actually almost 1,000 years later, because that was Christmas Day 800 AD when Charlemagne was crowned. 1,000 years later, and Napoleon is now crowning himself. It's just kind of a fun little story that shows you Napoleon's true colors. Here's another painting he had commissioned of himself. Certainly makes himself look important. Kind of like, I'm a big deal, and I want you to know it. As Napoleon continues to rule France, he continues to try to weaken the British, and he is really never successful at doing so. And that actually costs a lot of money. So to try to continue to fight his wars in Europe, specifically against the British, he needed to make some money. So in the early 1800s, the French control this large piece of property in what would become the United States, known as the Louisiana Purchase. And so in 1803, he sold that Louisiana territory that we called the Louisiana Purchase to President Jefferson for $15 million, which was a clear bargain at the time. Jefferson didn't even have the money to buy it, but he was able to kind of financially figure that out and effectively double the size of the United States. And so this money Napoleon would then use to help finance some of his wars in Europe. So continuing on here, Napoleon is going to create the largest empire in Europe since the Romans, and I'll show a couple of maps to kind of prove this. He's going to lose the Battle of Trafalgar to the British and Horatio Nelson. And this is a big deal. Not only does this show us he still can't defeat the British, but there's two big effects of this battle. First of all, it ensured the supremacy of the British Navy for the next 100 years. That proves that the British were #1 at sea. You really couldn't beat the British. Napoleon's great on land, but he does not have a navy that can rival the British. And the second thing this does is it really kind of, it opens his eyes. It forced Napoleon to give up his plans for trying to take over Britain. He'll still kind of try to weaken them, but it really, you know, he's going to know that defeating the British at sea is going to be very difficult. So after this, by 1812, Napoleon controlled Spain, the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, German kingdoms, as well as France. His armies were very successful in Europe, and that's part of the story I'm leaving out here, is how he goes and conquers and has military victory after military victory after military victory. Again, you kind of have to take my word for it that he was a military genius, and he's able to conquer a lot of Europe in the process. So by 1812, what you see here, obviously France is here in green, but you know, these purple areas are French allies, and these kind of light green areas become French satellites, like areas that France really has control or dominion over. So his empire in Europe is very, very large. He is definitely succeeding at trying to take over all of Europe. But the problem is he's going to make 3 colossal mistakes. Now, before I get into those 3 colossal mistakes, just a couple of slides I want to show you. This is Empress Josephine, his first wife. You can take a look at her bedroom here, kind of very, very beautiful and luxurious. This is Napoleon's throne. I particularly like the little soccer balls on his armrests here. This is Napoleon's bedchamber. So you can see definitely living a pretty nice life. And that was kind of typical for kings or queens to have, in this case, or emperors to have different bedchambers than their spouses. That was somewhat typical procedure in royalty. And here's just one more map, just to kind of give you the last lingering idea that Napoleon's going to control everything in this dark green color, this light green color, and the countries in purple are the countries that are allied with him. But you're going to find out that he's going to make a big mistake trying to invade Russia here and take over Moscow, and that's going to cost him dearly. So we're going to look at his 3 big mistakes on part 2. So go ahead and hit pause, and you can go ahead and queue up part 2. At this point, we've basically seen his successes. Now we're going to see his downfalls.